And now I'd like to introduce Pam Schreiber, who's going to introduce this wonderful program to us. Go ahead, Pam.
Thank you, Cal. Thank you, and welcome everybody. We're so delighted you could join us today to hear about what I and many other people in Philadelphia consider one of our special gems, the Rosenbach Museum and Library. I'm going to give you just a little history for a sense of context about this, and then we can proceed with the talk. Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach, and his years are 1876 to 1952, who achieved international fame and fortune as a dealer of rare books and manuscripts, was the driving force behind the creation of the museum and library that now bears his name. Founded in 1954, the Rosenbach preserves one of the world's greatest collections of literature and history, as well as a significant collection of fine and decorative arts. The quality of its holdings is eminently comparable with those of the nation's finest repositories, such as the Morgan Library and Museum, the Huntington Library, Museum and Gardens, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and others, including, not incidentally, the Rare Book Department of the Free Library of Philadelphia. The Rosenbach has been stewarding and further developing Dr. Rosenbach's personal collections ever since. They have grown by some 100,000 items since inception and now number over 400,000 total objects. The growth of the Rosenbach's collections, and in particular the programs that now activate them, receive new energy and ambition following the Rosenbach's formal affiliation with the Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation in 2013. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the lovely invitation we've been provided by the Rosenbach for our COS Club members to consider. And just as an alert, I put in the chat the person you should contact if you are interested in pursuing any of these opportunities. The Rosenbach welcomes members of the COS Club to join the Rosenbach either at a general member level or the Delancey Society. As a special benefit for the COS Club members, we are offering a 20% off memberships at all levels for the next week until May 6th. To sign up and receive your discount, call Gwen, whose name and email are in the chat. She'll sign you up, give you your discount, tell you all about what the programs are coming up. She's waiting for your call and to inform you more fully about the opportunities. Finally, to visit the Rosenbach for one day, we have been given by them a number to use when you call for an appointment. This will entitle 2 people to visit free of charge. In other words, if you and a friend or couple would like to visit for a day and you're members of the COS Club, we're going to leave this number with Agneta. You can call her, make an appointment, get the number, and visit at your convenience if you decide you'd like to. So, and I think that's maybe enough information right now, and I'd like to hand it over to Alex, who will talk to us about the program.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, for your wonderful introduction to the Rosenbach, and thank you, Pam and Cal and everyone at the COS Club for welcoming us here this evening. I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say how thrilled we are to be here with you and to have the opportunity to have this conversation. We love talking about books, and so this is a wonderful opportunity for us. My name is Alex Ames. I work as Collections Engagement Manager at the Rosenbach, and I'm joined this evening by my colleagues in the Collections Department for this conversation. So again, it's truly a great pleasure to be gathered as a community to discuss what makes a rare book rare. We have a lot of content prepared to discuss with you tonight. We're going to cover a lot of ground. Before we dive into the presentation, I would like to just give a little bit of an overview about where we're going in terms of the conversation we're having before we kick off the presentation. To help orient you to who we are and why we are here presenting this evening about what makes a rare book rare, we'll begin by sharing some biographical details about ourselves and the work that we do at the Rosenbach with the collections that Pam has described. I will then give a quick introductory history of the Rosenbach, echoing some of the themes that Pam mentioned, and providing some details about our collection before introducing you to a theory of what makes a rare book rare, which is really the big question that we're asking in tonight's presentation. And to answer that question, each of my colleagues and I will engage in what we're calling a lightning round. We're each going to talk about one of our favorite objects in the Rosenbach's collection and then apply this theory of what makes a rare book rare to that object, just to give you a sense of how we think about rarity, which is such a central concept to the work that we do every day in terms of stewarding our collections, interpreting them, and adding to the collections as well. Finally, we'll tie all of these strands together with some concluding thoughts and leave plenty of time at the end of our presentation for questions and discussion. So with that, I want to invite all of my colleagues to share a little bit about themselves to help you and the COS Club get to know us a bit better. Judy, let's start with you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Judy Guston, and I am the curator and director of collections at the Rosenbach. And from that sort of dual title, you can tell that I'm part curator, which means that my job sort of revolves around the stewardship of our collection, and which means basically care, acquisitions, things like that. And also its interpretation through programs like this one, exhibitions, and other programs on site and online. As director of collections, I get to work with all of these lovely people who are incredibly smart, who I work with every day, and that's a great benefit for me. So I will pass you on to the first one of those, Joby Zink.
Thank you, Judy. I'm Joby, and I am the registrar. And so most of my work is done behind the scenes. And so it's really nice to see people and present to you, even if we're not in person. Lots of questions about what is a museum registrar, because it's a weird word. So if a college registrar maintains all the files on all the students, a museum registrar does the same thing, maintains all the files on all the objects and books in the collection. So all of the deeds of gifts and invoices from purchases, research queries, publications, and insurance information. And I'm also in charge of loans going in and out of the museum and for exhibitions and other public programs. And with that, I'm throwing it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Joby. I'm Elizabeth Fuller. I'm the librarian at the Rosenbach. Librarians do all kinds of things in all kinds of different libraries. My role at the Rosenbach is in part to look after the cataloging of the book and manuscript collections. I also work a lot with the researchers who come on site to study the collections. In recent ordinary years, we've had an average of 150 visits a year by people from all over the world who are both working on all kinds of research projects as well as just personal interest. I also, with other members of the department, answer a lot of questions from people offsite who can't get to us, and serve also as an internal resource for other collections and program staff members about what's in the collections. And that brings us back around full circle to Alex.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I'll just expand on what I mentioned earlier by saying that my job title, Collections Engagement Manager, really says it all about what I do at the Rosenbach. I have a unique position in that I have one foot in the collections department, working every day with Joby, Elizabeth, and Judy, and another foot in the Rosenbach's education and interpretation department. And we, of course, we all work very closely together, but my role is really to liaise between these departments and spend my days thinking about how we can make our collections accessible and interesting and engaging for as wide a population as possible. So it's a wonderful task to be given, to think about how we can make our holdings come to life as widely as possible. So now that you know a little bit more about us as individuals and the work that we do every day, as I mentioned previously, I want to say a little bit more about the history of the Rosenbach. We are a unique institution, as you're probably gathering from just the comments that we've shared already. And I think a little bit of context will be of use to you as we start diving in to look at individual collection objects. So just by way of some historical context, as Pam mentioned earlier, the Rosenbach is really, was founded by Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach and his brother Philip Rosenbach. The Dr. Rosenbach, who held a PhD in English literature from the University of Pennsylvania, sort of looms larger in this sibling pair. Dr. Rosenbach was in his day the best known rare book dealer in the world. He was really a celebrity. He lived with his brother Philip on Delancey Place for much of their lives, and together, through the Rosenbach Company, built many of the great rare book libraries in the United States. Dr. Rosenbach was inspired as a young person to enter this sort of unique world, the rarefied world of rare book dealing, by his bookseller uncle Moses Pollock, who really helped launch him into the field. The Rosenbach as a public institution was established in 1954, and the collections have grown substantially since our founders' lifetimes, with key expansions in areas that are really, really closely associated with our institution today. So for example, the James Joyce collection, the Marianne Moore collection, the Bram Stoker Dracula collection, our collection of American portraiture, Judaica, other collecting areas. These are key areas of strength that future generations of curators and collection stewards have grown over the years. And our current areas of program and outreach interest really guide how we collect. Those of you who are familiar with our institution, it may well be through some of our public programs, and the work that we do in outreach really does inform what objects we decide to add to our collection. We work with private donors, we work with dealers, auction houses, to add works to our collection. So even though the sort of original footprint of our collection was laid by our founders, we are dynamic, growing, and in some senses changing to this very day. So this leads me to the heart of the conversation that we're going to be engaging in for the rest of our time together tonight. The big question, the title of our talk: what makes a rare book rare? And the important thing for you to understand is that Dr. Rosenbach was such a huge influence, a titan of the rare book world and the rare book dealing world, that his understanding of rarity as a concept really, to this day, continues to define how we think about what rarity is in the rare book world, even if his name isn't attached to it all the time, sort of in the broader rare book community. Dr. Rosenbach's understanding of rarity is something that is still felt today. And this diagram is a handy way to think about it. There are four main component parts of rarity as Dr. Rosenbach saw it and as we apply it today in our work at the Rosenbach. And you see them in the circular portion of this chart on the upper left of your screen. Those four main component parts are scarcity, demand, condition, and importance. Three of these are pretty self-explanatory: scarcity of an object, demand for an object, the condition of an object, the physical condition of an object. Importance is a bit more of a catch-all term. So you can see in the lower right portion of the screen, we break out some of the various strands of what might constitute importance when we're talking about a rare book. Things like scholarly value, provenance, or who owned the book, signs of readership, etc. I'm not going to spend more time right now talking about this in a theoretical sense. I just want to introduce this chart to you. And now what we're going to do is my colleagues and I will walk you through the application of these concepts to various objects from our collection. And you'll see how this understanding of rarity really does shape the way we look at our collections. So this will be our lightning round. We'll each share one of our favorite things from the collection and then draw all these strands together at the end. And I'd like to get started by asking Judy to share her favorite thing.
Thanks, Alex. So for those of you who are familiar with the Rosenbach and have been on site, it may have been a long time ago at this point. It feels like that for us too. This is the Rosenbach's historic parlor. And you can see that on the walls surrounding this parlor are portraits of members of the Gratz family of Philadelphia. We're going to be talking about an object that belonged to the guy who's there over the mantle, Michael Gratz. Can I have the next slide, please, Alex? Thank you. Michael Gratz, here seen in a beautiful portrait by Thomas Sully, was born in Upper Silesia, and by the time he was 14, he'd already traveled from London to India and back on a merchant ship. He later immigrated to Philadelphia in 1759 when he was 19. He and his older brother, who preceded him here to Philadelphia, opened a business as merchants, B&M Gratz merchants, by 1769, the same year that Michael married Miriam Simon. They had 12 children together, 10 of whom survived to adulthood, and 4 of whom happened to be depicted in portraits in the Rosenbach parlor. He was very active in the revolution in all kinds of ways, including supplying Washington's army, using his merchant ship as a blockade runner, and porting supplies overland to blockaded American cities during the Revolution. And he also owned sort of vast tracts of land in the Ohio River Valley, Kentucky, and Virginia. In Philadelphia, he helped to found Mikveh Israel, the city's first synagogue, and he was one of the founders of the Academy of Fine Arts, very supportive of the artistic community, as some of his children were as well. Can I have the next slide? So the object we're looking at is this pocket almanac. It's sort of shown open with its cover facing us. When it's closed up, it's about 2 inches wide and 4 inches high, and originally had 52 pages in it. It's a smaller almanac than the one that most people used at home because it was intended for travel, and it's why it's called a pocket almanac. So this is the first kind of printed almanac that was actually sold with a protective cover, which is what's shown here, because these almanacs in general were considered ephemeral, meaning that you would use them for the year that they were intended for, just like any old paper calendar, and then sort of get rid of it. But these needed a protective cover because people sort of put them through all kinds of abuse as they were traveling. Almanacs in general were second only to the Bible in annual sales in early America. So you can see what an important and valuable asset this was, particularly to people like Michael Gratz. It's a Poor Will's Almanac, as you can see from the little title down there. This is called Poor Will's Pocket Almanac for the year 1777. And Poor Will was one of the publishers of almanacs, one of only 4 who published almanacs during the year 1777, possibly due to paper shortages during the war. Can I have the next slide? So as we open it up, we see that it was owned by Michael Gratz, and you can see that from his signature in the upper right. And it was later owned by a relative of his, Frank Marks Edding, on the left. Edding's paternal grandmother was one of Michael Gratz's daughters. Our founders collected Gratz-related materials, and we continue to collect significant objects related to that family. Almanacs were in general fitted to specific locations, this one for the Philadelphia and surrounding areas, and contained what's called here useful information for their users, particularly those like Michael Gratz, who traveled constantly for work. Can I have the next slide? So almanacs were made with interleaved blank pages, such as the one on the right, that were intended for note-taking. The explanation on the page on the left shows that the material on the printed monthly pages of the almanac includes astronomical occurrences, church festivals, and weather predictions. Michael Gratz is here jotting notes about payments in dollars, very typical for something a merchant would include in his almanac. Can I have the next slide? At the back of the almanac, after the annual calendar, these useful tables appear, and they include such information as roads to and from Philadelphia, conversions from British pounds to American dollars, which was happening at that point during the Revolution, interest accrued on regular amounts over time. And you should know that here they were charging interest at 6 to 7%. Dates when court was in session because the courts traveled, so you had to know when they were going to be in town, traveling fairs or markets, and times of tides, very helpful for a merchant to determine when a ship might come into port. But there's something really unusual hidden inside this particular almanac. Can I have the next slide? Beginning on the blank pages opposite the printed calendar months, Michael Gratz has carefully entered a Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, so all festivals begin in the evening when the moon can be sighted. Typical listings are feasts, fasts, and Sabbaths. So just to give you an example of what's in here, reading the Hebrew from right to left opposite the English date of January 8, we see something that reads Erev Rosh Chodesh Shabbat. That's the evening on which the new moon signals the beginning of the Hebrew month of Shabbat. The little squiggle that you see over the first 3 letters there on the right denotes that this is an abbreviation. In English, it would be ERC, Erev Rosh Chodesh. Other abbreviations below include the Sabbath, which is named by its reading from the Torah. So if you look opposite January 11th, you'll see a little swirly letter, which is the Hebrew letter that makes the sound P. And over it, the squiggle that notes that it's an abbreviation. It's an abbreviation for the word Parsha, which just means portion of the Torah. And this is the Parsha Vayera, which is the portion of the Torah that describes the 10 plagues in Egypt, and also happens to be my nephew's bar mitzvah passage. Can I have the next page, please? Although the Gratz Almanac is a unique survival of a Hebrew calendar annotated within a printed almanac, we see that it was a regular practice of the Gratz family, as shown in this letter from the American Jewish Historical Society. Here, Michael's brother Bernard writes to his own son-in-law, Solomon Edding, who happens to be the great-great-uncle of Frank Marx Edding, who owned this almanac. He says, I have an almanac for you to put all the Hebrew feasts and fasts in it, which shall send by first safe opportunity. This letter was sent when the Edding family moved to Baltimore, where there was no established Jewish community. So here the annotated almanac is intended to keep the Eddings connected to their co-religionists across geography and time. Can I have the next slide? In February and March, we see in the almanac, we see evidence that the Jewish year that coincides with 1777 is actually a leap year. Jewish leap years insert an entire month, and it's always the month of Adar, into the calendar. On the 9th and 10th here, we see the beginning of the second month of Adar, followed by holidays which are celebrated only during the second instance of this inserted month. Such entries in each month, opposite the printed calendar, which is the secular calendar, show where the Jewish calendar and the secular calendar are similar and where there is tension between them. Can I have the next slide? By examining the calendar and linking inscribed events to Gratz's family and business life and his religious practice reflected in other period documents, we get a more complete picture of his identity as a religious Jew. By examining the context in which people of other faiths understood their own place in the temporal world, we can see that at this time, there was a more profound and widespread ability of other Americans to understand and respond to the different ebbs and flows of their Jewish neighbors' annual celebratory cycle. Can I have the next slide? Through this annotated almanac, Michael Gratz expressed his experience as porous, simultaneously expressive of 2 cultures, Jewish and American. We can view the almanac as a metaphor for Gratz himself, as he envisioned his Jewish identity linked to an ancient faith tradition and practiced in a contemporary setting, while also being a vital participant in the shaping of the nascent American experiment. Can I have the next slide? So now we're back to the sort of rubric that Alex presented earlier, and we're going to put this almanac through this little test of rarity. I want to start with scarcity. So it's the only extant almanac with an annotated Hebrew calendar in it. So that and the fact that it's got a person's own manuscript annotations makes it singular. So it's incredibly scarce. There's just one. Demand is a really interesting thing. We usually think of demand as being part of a marketplace, a financial marketplace, but this has been in our collection. And the demand that we experience within an institution is more linked to the other things having to do with its importance and its scholarly value. And I can tell you this almanac, and also its use. I mean, we have used this almanac in exhibitions and programs like this one a lot. So within our institution, its demand is pretty robust. Its condition is quite good. We have done conservation treatment to this since the first picture I showed to you of its cover. So its condition is now excellent. Getting to importance, this is where this thing really sings. I want to start with provenance, meaning it's got, it's connected to people and its ownership and things like that. So this was owned by Michael Gratz, who was an important early Jewish American who was involved in the revolution and who is actually related not only to a lot of institutions in Philadelphia, which he helped found and his children helped found, but he's also related to our founders. So that means that this almanac's association with Michael Gratz makes it rather important in all of those ways. Next to that institutional and scholarly value, I have been working with this almanac, interpreting it since 1998. I used it as the subject matter of my master's thesis at Winterthur. Since then, other scholars have used the discoveries from this almanac in their own scholarly research. So things get kind of passed along. And we have used it in a lot of programs at the Rosenbach. So it has a high institutional and scholarly value. In terms of beauty and printing quality, well, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder where this is concerned. Because these were ephemeral objects, printers didn't pay a whole lot of attention to how beautiful they were. But in my eyes, this is a real winner. Signs of readership, you saw Michael Gratz had annotated all over this thing. So that's signs of his use. But it's not just his use here, it's his manipulation of this as a reader and user that changes it materially from the original printed almanac to be something of greater interpretive value. In terms of its format, the pocket almanac is a great format in early America. As we discussed, the almanacs were second only to the Bible in use. So the format is a really important one. And some of us just like to study the almanac because there's so much in there that's pretty rich and tells us a lot about early American culture. Significance to book history really lies in that format. This is an early form that was incredibly used by the population. And so it is significant to production of books in that regard. So I will now turn this over to Joby, who's going to show you one of her favorite things.
Thank you again, Judy. So I'm a very different favorite thing than the almanac. My favorite object in the collection is the manuscript for An Adventure in the Empty House by Arthur Conan Doyle. So it's in this unassuming vellum cover, and this is what's known as a fair copy manuscript. And I apologize, my neighbor seems to be running a power saw, so I apologize if you can hear that. So what's interesting is before he began writing his Sherlock Holmes stories, Doyle was actually a doctor. He was an ophthalmologist, and he served as a doctor on board a ship, and he opened a medical practice in London, but allegedly wasn't seeing any patients, so had a lot of time to write. And he writes a total of 4 novels and 56 short stories featuring Sherlock Holmes, the great gentleman detective. Sherlock Holmes makes his first appearance in 1887 in a Christmas issue, and the first story is called A Study in Scarlet. So the first 2 Holmes novels had moderate appeal, but the subsequent short stories were published in serial format in the Strand magazine, and these were very affordable, which meant that a lot more people began to read them. And then as these stories became more popular, they were published as a collection. There was 2 collections, each one had like 12 stories in it. But Doyle really wanted to work on more serious things. So in order to do that, he had to kill off his main character in dramatic fashion. So you can see Holmes meeting his nemesis Moriarty and being sent over the cliffs at Rosenbach Falls. This occurs in the story The Final Problem that is published in 1893. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I said, this was a fair copy manuscript. Actually, I'm going to step back a little bit and say that during his hiatus, while he's writing historical fiction, there is public outcry for more Sherlock Holmes stories, like a lot. So Doyle writes a novel. It's called The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes stories. And he fits this plot earlier into the Sherlock Holmes timeline. So it doesn't strike anyone as odd that Sherlock Holmes dies and now there's a new story. This happens before. And the public really loves it. And there is outcry for more and more. And finally, Doyle acquiesces. And what you're seeing here on the page is the first Sherlock Holmes short story that was written like in 10 years. It's set 3 years after The Final Problem, as you'll see in the first line. And so this manuscript is called a fair copy. I've said this several times. And that means that it's not a draft that he's working on. It doesn't have notes. It doesn't have scratch outs. It's essentially what Doyle has written and what he's going to send to the publisher to set to type. And it's in 3 of these charming exercise notebooks. And I just love how like the little daisies on the front, they just make me so happy. So there we have Doyle's super clean, super clear handwriting. And you can see like as the ink fades at the bottom of the page. And this paper is actually kind of brittle and fragile. And you can see from the cover that we've had some conservation work done on there. It's possible that he might have written another fair copy manuscript, but really there should just be one. So can I have the next slide, please? So when you open the vellum cover, you see the name W.K. Bixby scrawled widely across the front fly. And William K. Bixby is an art and rare book collector and philanthropist from St. Louis. And in 1929, Bixby sold his entire English literature collection to Dr. Rosenbach. And some of that collection, Dr. R went on to sell to other buyers and collectors, but Dr. R very purposely retained this manuscript for his personal collection. And this is, on the other side is a picture of Bixby's book plate. It's not in the manuscript, but I just kind of love it. I know Alex is a big fan of it. The octopus as a collector, gathering things in. Can I have the next slide? So what I really like about this manuscript is how it specifically appeals to Dr. Rosenbach. Not really because Dr. Rosenbach was a great lover of detective fiction, but because in the story, it's Watson who bumps into, and I quote, some poor bibliophile who either as a trade or as a hobby was a collector of obscure volumes. And it's just charming. So later in the story, the bookseller shows up at 221B Baker Street. He offers the books to Watson, divests himself of his costume, and reveals that it's Sherlock Holmes. And then in the page, you can see that Watson then just faints because, you know, his best friend he hasn't seen in years just shows up and he's not dead. But I think like Dr. R would really love it because is there any greater compliment than to have this most famous, you know, detective masquerading as a book dealer. So now we're going to switch and see how it holds up to the definition of a rare book. Thank you. So we're going to start at the top with importance. Is Adventure of an Empty House a truly brilliant piece of literature? Some might say yes, but it's probably not the greatest work on the entire planet. But it is a really important book from a cultural perspective. Adventure of an Empty House is like the pivotal work in the Sherlock Holmes canon. The hero is resurrected after a nearly 10-year hiatus. And then not only does Doyle go on to write 30 more Sherlock Holmes short stories, but there have been countless theatrical and film and TV adaptations that continue to appeal to audiences today. So scarcity. It is a fair copy manuscript, so it is one of a kind. Even if there is another fair copy manuscript, it's not going to have the same little ink blots or any smears or crossouts. That would be totally different. Demand. One might say that it is precisely the public's demand for more Sherlock Holmes adventures that brought this manuscript into being. And that's certainly going to elevate the demand for this particular manuscript. The condition, as I said, the cover was brittle and the pages have undergone conservation. The cover was stabilized, the pages were kind of washed and cleaned up a bit. So now it's in really good condition. And then we're going to jump down to the scholarly and institutional value. So Sherlock Holmes has a lot of devoted fans. So there's a lot of interest in seeing this manuscript when you come to the Rosenbach. And also, because it was conserved earlier, we've been able to use it in exhibitions at the Rosenbach, and it has been used in several exhibitions on loan to other institutions, including in London. So that was really exciting. Provenance, the connection to William Bixby, another great book collector, is going to increase the importance and value of this manuscript in the book collecting world. To have two great book collectors own this manuscript, amazing. Beauty and printing quality. I would say that Doyle actually has some pretty nice handwriting, which helps elevate the everydayness of the composition book, which again by format is usually pretty ephemeral. And then significance to book history. There's nothing about the format of this that is truly one of a kind, but from a popular culture perspective, I think it's got a lot of importance. And with that, I'm gonna say, Elizabeth, you're up.
Joby. What I like about this book is that at first glance, there doesn't seem to be anything rare about it. You could find a copy of this at any used bookshop or website for a really unremarkable price. It's a very ordinary mid-20th century book about the Brooklyn Bridge. It's well researched, it's well written, really interesting to people who are interested in the subject, but it's not something with any great literary value or great mass appeal. What's special about it is that it belonged to Marianne Moore, who was one of the best known and best regarded American poets of the early and mid 20th century. And unlike many books that belong to significant people, it didn't just, we don't just know that it belonged to her. We can see in amazing detail how she used it. So in the next slide, at the upper left, we'll see a passage that she marked in the margin. It contains the phrase catenary curve. This is a precise mathematical term for the kind of curve that's formed by the cables of a suspension bridge. And this passage explains why it's so well suited to that purpose. Most of Moore's annotations, though, weren't made in the text of her books, but on the blank pages at the back. On the right-hand side of the slide, we see that she's used the 2 blank pages, and they're at the end, and there are 2 more just as densely annotated. She's made her own index. The detail of the lower left shows the further notes she's made on the passage that's right above it. Begins with a page number, so she could always go in the index and find where to go back to in the book. She grasped really how important this curve is to the whole plan of the bridge. She copied out several of the sentences verbatim and condensed a number of the writer's other points for her later use. So in the next slide, we'll see how she used it. This is the poem Granite and Steel, probably the most important of her late poems. It's all about the Brooklyn Bridge. We're seeing it here as it first came out in book form, first published in the New Yorker, but the first book appearance was in her book, Tell Me, which you see in the middle. It takes its part of its subtitle, Granite, Steel, and other topics, from the title of this poem, and as a handsome illustration of the bridge on the cover. The second stanza has that phrase, catenary curve. And because she knows her readers aren't going to be familiar with that term, but her readers are the kind of people who want to understand such things, and she's the kind of poet who wants to make sure her readers understand the poem, she has provided at the end of the book, and this was a common practice of hers, she's provided at the end of this book of poetry a section of notes. So the notes for this poem you'll see on the right. She's noting where it was first published. That's always helpful to know. And then she's given a very proper scholarly citation to the book we've just been looking at, her source for this. And she's got detailed notes below it about 2 passages in the poem that she's where she's drawn on it, and the one that's circled below is where she found that curve, the passage we saw marked at the beginning. Now let's apply our principles of rarity to this one. Scarcity. This book probably wasn't printed in an enormous number of copies. It's not something that they expected wide distribution, but it wasn't a very limited edition either. And unlike the almanac that Judy showed us, it's a book that's intended to last for more than a year. It's more sturdily made. Most of the copies weren't used every day. And since it's 200 years newer than the almanac, fewer copies have gotten lost or thrown away over time. So there's still a lot of ordinary copies that exist. The annotations in this particular copy make it not only scarce, but unique. It's in quite good condition. It shows a few, not many signs of wear apart from the dust jacket. Now, if this were a book that was deemed inherently collectible, the first edition of a great novel or something like that, a book that didn't have specific where the associations or nothing about this particular copy was important, then the condition of the dust jacket would really come into play, and a tattered dust jacket would really affect the assessment of condition. But here that's not the case. This is the copy that's important, and this is the condition that this copy is in. The demand for it is related to its importance in other ways. So let's work through the importance. It has great scholarly importance because it's source material for one author's works, and was always very well regarded by her contemporary poets, and even though she's fallen out of the great public eye, she is still very much studied, and every bit of source material for any writer's work is really valuable to researchers. It's important to the Rosenbach institutionally because it's a part of one of our major research collections. We have all of Moore's working papers, personal papers, all the books that were in her library at her death, about 2,600, even her living room. And all of these objects that are linked to each other through ways that she used them in her work. The provenance, Moore's ownership, of course, is important, and we've just been saying why. And the fact that not only do we know that she used it, but these signs of readership, they're evidence of one author's working method. So they're interesting to not only scholars of Moore, scholars of, people who are interested in the way writers write, and people who are interested more broadly in the history of reading, which is a field of study in itself these days. There's nothing special about this book in terms of beauty or book history or format, but all the other factors are quite enough to make it rare. And with that, I'll hand us back to Alex for our final lightning round selection.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I want to share with you as my favorite thing selection from the Rosenbach's collection, something that probably doesn't actually rise to the level of my favorite thing in terms of my scholarly interests. I'm an historian of early America, but this object is something I wanted to share with you because when I first began my job at the Rosenbach, engaging with this set of Charles Dickens works, which you see in our sort of behind the scenes storage on those lower shelves, that set of 79 volumes that all look quite similar. These materials really engaged my attention because of the beauty of the books and because of the mystery of cracking these volumes open and sort of leafing through them and wrestling with this idea of rarity. Because I would propose to you, and as you will see momentarily, this set of Dickens works both defines rarity as a concept and completely confuses and confounds the concept. And it's you'll see why I say that momentarily. But when we look at a volume, which you see on the screen, this really beautiful, green leather binding with this rich gold embossed ornament, sort of this Moorish design, you can tell that this set of the works of Charles Dickens, published in 1903 by Chapman and Hall in London, who were Dickens publishers during his lifetime for various portions of his writing career, you can tell that this is a set that was meant to impress. This is a luxe object meant to look beautiful on a genteel bookshelf. I would argue that the fact that this was printed as a collector's object suggests that it's sort of, you could describe it, at least on the surface level, as being what we sometimes refer to as medium rare in the book world, that it's sort of, if something is intended to be collectible, it's not actually a collector's object. We get catalogs with collector's items today, right, that are sort of mass-produced objects. So in that regard, it's the sort of thing that one might think is a materially beautiful object, but maybe not huge collector value or huge rarity. But the thing about this particular set is that it's what we refer to as a Grangerized set of books, by which I mean that other materials have been added into this published set of the works of Charles Dickens, such that what we're actually looking at here on the shelves is not just 79 volumes of well-known Dickens works, but 79 sort of receptacles for other materials, including, in this case, original artworks, original watercolors based on the works of Charles Dickens, and even, as we shall see, some manuscript material, by which I mean handwritten historical material. So this whole thing is a mystery to explore. And I want to just walk you through with some pictures what it was like for me the first time opening up the first volume of this set. And the first volume contains the Pickwick Papers. So the minute that you open the book, if you look at the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you instantly realize that this is a luxury item. This is a classy publication. Rather than just blank white pages, what do you have? You have an illustration from the Pickwick Papers, a famous scene from the Pickwick Papers, which has been rendered on leather and adhered to the back of the front cover of the book. And facing that leather illustration is not paper, it's red moire silk. So you can get the sense of what type of bibliophile this book was published for. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, what do we have but an original watercolor portrait of Mr. Pickwick himself? So that, it would be easy to look at this and think that it's a photographic reproduction. It is not. It is an actual watercolor painted by hand. Here on the right-hand corner, right-hand side of the screen, you see the first title page in the book, which makes clear that this series had originally been published in 34 volumes, but was extended by the publisher to 79 volumes. So they took something originally intended to fit in 39 individual books, and they expanded it. They fattened it up with other content, namely these watercolors and other facsimiles or copies of historical material. So here's an example of some of this added content. Here we have an illuminated title page, hand illuminated on parchment or animal skin, depicting a scene from the Pickwick Papers. And on your right, you have a facsimile of an historical artifact, essentially, a title page, the illustrations to the Pickwick Club, London, 1882. So this is a sort of a historical reproduction, if you will. Then you get to the second title page where we see that apparently the book will now start with the Pickwick Papers. Turn the page, and what do you have but this document tipped in or adhered to this blank leaf in the book? And I didn't recognize the handwriting at first because I'm not a Dickens scholar, but I instantly recognized the name or the name of the house on top of the stationery, Gad's Hill. Well, that's Dickens' country place. And this is, in fact, an original Dickens letter dated 1869, signed by Dickens, that someone, perhaps the publisher, perhaps a collector, adhered to this page in the book. Who put it there? Not exactly sure. Very possible that the publisher issued this luxe edition with some original content, sort of original historical material incorporated into the volume. Well, if that wasn't enough, I sort of walked by this set of books regularly on my trips into and out of storage. And finally, one day, there was sort of this glimmer in my eye, in the corner of my eye, and I realized that volume 79 in the series isn't actually a book. I could tell that that text block, the pages between the front and back covers, they weren't actually pages. It was a storage box. So that, I, of course, had to satiate my curiosity. So I pulled it off the shelf, took it into the reading room, and what, to my surprise, do I encounter? But opening up this box, which is only pretending to be a book, inside is an actual important historical manuscript. What is this manuscript that is secretly housed inside this pretend book? Now we're in the realm of scholarly importance. This document that you're looking at is a manuscript expense account kept by an agent of Dickens. As many of you are probably aware, Dickens was quite famous for his public readings that he would do. Well, if you're going to give a public reading, you need to advertise that it's going to happen. And so when these public readings would happen, someone would have to order broadsides and other materials to be produced to be printed to advertise the talk by Dickens. And so this is a manuscript document with the information about the expenses incurred to advertise Dickens' talks, his public readings. So what do we make of this object if we think about the concept of rarity that my colleagues have so expertly laid out for us? Well, let's start with condition, because that's probably the easiest one with this set. The condition is great, most likely because it's been in the Rosenbach's collection for so long. It's actually in very good condition. The fact that it's the complete set of 79 volumes is really amazing. Demand, Dickens was and probably always will be highly collectible because he's such a famous and important British author. Scarcity is an interesting one. The publisher who produced this volume they made a lot of hay out of Charles Dickens because they had been his publisher during his lifetime, and they produced many, many, many editions of these sets of his work. This is where research comes into play. And my initial research suggests that the 36 volume set is held in various libraries and is even available in the rare book market. 79 volume sets seem quite rare. And when you add in the fact that there seems to be original manuscript material incorporated as well, that's where you're really starting to talk about rarity. It's also, I would argue, where you're really starting to talk about importance. From an institutional perspective, this is a wonderful set of books because they're so much fun to look through, to hold, to explore. There's scholarly value as well with the manuscript material and from a book historical perspective, in the sense that this does tell us a lot about Dickens and his afterlife in the hands of the Chapman and Hall Publishing Company. Beauty and printing quality and format, those all really figure into this particular object as well. It's an object of tremendous material beauty and visual beauty, which certainly plays into the overall rarity that we are talking about with this particular set of artifacts. So with that, I want to now just take a step back. We've heard about a lot of different kinds of objects in the Rosenbach's collection, and I just want to summarize by saying that these four key component parts of what makes a rare book rare, scarcity, demand, condition, and importance, really present a wonderful tool to use in interrogating objects, both individual pieces in our collection, as we've done tonight, but also thinking about objects in the context of larger collections within our institution and really the whole ecosystem of rare books, manuscripts, archives, and museum collections across our city, our nation, and our world. I think that we've demonstrated how these four component parts interact together. And this is both a sort of a formalistic way to look at the topic, but also a really flexible way to examine this topic. We truly hope that tonight is just the beginning of your engagement with the Rosenbach. We have, let's see, approximately 399,996 other objects that we can show you in our collection, and it would be a real pleasure to be able to do so. And I just want to highlight a few specific opportunities that are coming up. Pam has already outlined the really wonderful offers that have been put together specifically for the Cosmopolitan Club, but I just want to mention a few other free virtual offerings that are coming up soon as part of the Rosenbach's well-known Bloomsday celebrations. On June 9th at 7 p.m., we will be doing a free virtual talk with Professor Vincent Cheng, who will be offering us some new perspectives on James Joyce's novel Ulysses, specifically interpreting it through the lens of post-colonial studies. The Will to Forget, Memory, the Nation, and Ulysses. That's a free talk. On June 24th, we'll be following up Dr. Cheng's lecture with a parlor recital broadcasted live from the Rosenbach's historic parlor titled Love's Old Sweet Song, The Music of James Joyce, which draws on resources from the music department at the Free Library of Philadelphia as well. So we do hope that you'll sign up for these free events. I will put the links in the chat box following the program. Please know that we in the collections department are at your disposal. If you have any questions, if you have any things, any topics you want to discuss that we didn't get a chance to tonight, here are our email addresses. We can also stick those in the chat box as well during the Q&A so that you have easy access. But please know that we're very, very happy to answer any questions or engage in continued conversation. So with that, I want to thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure to be a part of this evening. Thank you, Cal. Thank you, Pam. And I know my colleagues and I are all very much looking forward to continuing the conversation in the Q&A session.
Well, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. We do have some questions. Dorothy Nicholson has a few questions. The first is, does the Rosenbach have a relationship with the rare book department of the Free Library, and do you exhibit with them?
Elizabeth, do you want to talk about the background for that relationship?
Sure.
Elizabeth Fuller, do you want to talk about the background for that? You're muted.
Oh, yeah, thanks. All right. Yes, Dr. Rosenbach was a trustee of the Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation, an institution that actually formed before the city had a public library in order to get a public library for the city. Once the city agency was founded, the foundation has continued to exist to raise funds for it, to especially to supplement the budget for things that the city budget won't stretch to, like the wonderful series of author talks, summer reading programs, etc. And the foundation owns the great collection of rare materials that are available to the public for in the central branch. Dr. Rosenbach was a trustee of the foundation for a long time, gave them some of very important collections, and sold some other things to people who gave them to the free library. So that relationship has existed for a long time. In 2013, we became formally affiliated with the foundation.
Thank you.
Um,
There's also a question about, Dorothy asked, she said she took a tour of the Rosenbach a few years ago, and it's her understanding that Rosenbach gave the manuscript of Alice in Wonderland to the United Kingdom, and wonders, is that correct? And what became of it?
Yes, that's correct. It's a rather long story, but part of it involves, when you really like one of these rare books, you find it hard to let go. When he first bought it at an auction in England, it was a very difficult thing. He paid a lot for it, more than any institutions in England could afford, and it was seen almost as taking away some of some of the British sort of cultural material and bringing it to the United States. He did offer it to any of those who were bidding in the auction for the same price he paid, but none of them could afford it. So he brought it to Philadelphia with him. Unfortunately, he really couldn't afford the amount of money he'd already paid for it. So he had to quickly dispense with it to a willing buyer, which he did rather quickly. But here's the thing, when you like something, particularly this object, which having seen it, I can tell you, it has a sort of weird appeal that you might not think you wanted at first, and then you see it and you think, I really have to have that. So when it was visiting with us, I sort of thought, maybe if I just grab it. But you don't do that kind of thing in our business. But Dr. Rosenbach decided to buy it for a second time when his initial buyer passed away and his estate was for sale. So Dr. Rosenbach purchased it again, at which time we were just past World War II. And a lot of Dr. R's friends thought it would be a really wonderful presentation to the British people for their assistance and collegiality in fighting the war. So he was convinced, and I'm quite sure it was really hard to convince him, that he should allow subscribers to pay back parts of his purchase price, so that together they could, through our National Gallery at the time, send it over back to the British as a gift from America, not just from this group of subscribers. Interestingly enough, people were paying Dr. Rosenbach even after his death for their part in this adventure. So that's what happened, and it's now in the British Library, and it can be seen online. So if you go to their site, you can actually page through it. It's really stunning. So I encourage that.
Were other manuscripts treated that way? That is given back to the country of origin under a subscription? This was sold, the sole
That's
one?
a good question. I don't know. Elizabeth, do you know that? I mean, we know that there are a bunch of things in our collection that Dr. R bought twice, but as far as giving by subscription, Elizabeth, do you have any idea about where that I mean, we know where the idea came from, but we don't know if it's done regularly at all. I don't really think so.
And we have a comment from Linda Robertson. Anyone with an interest in colonial furniture and decorative arts will find that a tour of the house is an exceptional treat. I second that in a minute.
Just to follow it back with Judy, I don't know about that particular funding model as anything that other people have followed, but if anybody has questions that we have not been able to answer during this chat, or that you think of later on our website, there's a section in the main menu for research, And if you click on that, you will find a form for sending in a query. That just sends a, that question comes to collection staff in email, and we will look into it and get back to you.
Are there any other questions not in the chat before we say goodnight to everybody? I don't see anybody hands up. We can't thank you enough for this wonderful presentation. And I know I'm a member of the Rosenbach, and Pam is on the board. And so we want to foster your visiting the Rosenbach under their very kind presentation to the Cos Club. Oh, Beverly has her hand up and she's very anxious to ask a question. You have to unmute yourself, Beverly. We can't hear you.
My husband, Albert Kaplan, my third husband, was a friend at the Rosenbach. And I saw the house when it was still set up. It was a Jewish home, and the picture of the girlfriend was on the fourth floor. The mother didn't have it down there. I want to know, how many Bibles do you have?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's something I would have to look back through our catalog to come up with. We don't have a discrete collection of Bibles, but there are Bibles in various sections of the collection that have been acquired for different purposes. So we
Do you
go.
you have any of the Gutenberg Bibles?
Our Gutenberg Bible lacks all but one leaf. That is, we only have one. We have one leaf from a Gutenberg Bible. Dr. Rosenbach bought and sold 4 of them during his career, but he didn't hold on to a complete one himself. We do have copies of the first 2 Bibles printed in Hebrew, the text of the first 5 books. We have the first complete Bible printed in the Western Hemisphere. We have other landmarks of Bible printing.
I think he was somebody from Allentown, had a lot of collected them. I think they got them for a guy from Allentown. He gave them to Princeton. It was a big to do, but Rosenbach was a salesman.
William Scheide.
Yeah,
was a very important collector at several generations of Scheides, and
they gave them to Princeton
yes.
University, because I had the opportunity to see some of them then.
Yes, that's an amazing collection there.
Well, again, we thank you. We all look forward to visiting the Rosenbach, and we hope you'll come back and see us again, and we look forward to a wonderful relationship between the Cos Club and the Rosenbach. So thank you all, and good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you very, very much.
Good night,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Good night. Really interesting.
Thank you.